Hello and welcome to Buddies Without Organs, a podcast dedicated to the philosopher Gilles Deleuze. I'm Sean and I'm joined as ever by Matt.
Hi Sean, Happy New Year, how are you doing? Nice
Happy
to be
New
back.
Year. It is nice to be back. We, as we intimated on Twitter, we did record episode 3 back before Christmas, but my computer decided to eat my audio, so we lost a very good couple of hours talking about the postscript on societies of control, which is now completely lost to the ether, but maybe we'll talk about that again at some point. But we're going to be talking about a different topic because we didn't want to try and recapture the magic. We just wanted to move on to something different.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate way to end the year. The grief of lost audio is real. But yeah, onwards and upwards for 2021. At least we're going onwards and upwards. I can't say that for the rest of the world, but
Yes, we are recording on the 7th of January, the day after the American Republic finally collapsed. As we've all long prayed it would. But it's been, so we decided that we wanted to begin with a little bit of topical conversation, basically just do the news, because it was such an extraordinary set of things to happen so suddenly that we have to talk about it at least a little bit before we start talking about desiring machines. And indeed, as is always the case, one conversation will flow into another, fold into another. So, Matt, what are you looking forward to now that democracy has ended?
bloody hell, that's not the question I thought was coming. God, I don't even know. I mean, I've got quite a busy January personally. But it all just feels like a big distraction. And then, sort of, I think from February onwards, I don't know. I'm anticipating to just disappear into a void, and not. I don't know. I feel totally listless. It was quite. I think it was something that I saw Edmund Berger post on Twitter yesterday that I think me and my girlfriend were just making dinner, and saw the sort of various news alerts pop up on my phone that the Capitol was being stormed in Washington DC, and we just had it on. We were streaming it. We watched it on her phone while we ate dinner, and then after we finished eating, I just suddenly became really bored with the whole thing and was just like, I don't know. Just total listlessness very soon onward. I think that was the sentiment that I saw from a few people that. Wow, yeah, the fall of democracy is pretty dull spectacle.
Because I said on Facebook quite a while ago, actually. I think it was when after the presidential election, I said something like American politics is cinematic and kind of sexy, while British politics is one of those dreary, grey BBC serials from the 1970s you watch out of a sense of obligation. But like even the cinematic appeal of watching the Capitol building getting stormed wasn't that cinematic, was it? Like there's some really like weird images that came from that as well, like how when they actually went into the Senate chamber, I think it was the Senate chamber or the House chamber, they stuck within the ropes, the velvet ropes that go down the carpet. They didn't like push them to one side, they just like marched in very, very strangely. And and it is that kind of and then they just didn't really know what to do, which was quite interesting to watch either. Sort of like they didn't do anything spectacularly interesting with this, like putting their feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk, or like that goon who stole a podium and then posed for a picture of it, so completely forgetting for a moment that he will be arrested for doing this. And there is this kind of like almost childlike energy that they were bringing with them, almost, where sort of like they've got the candy bar and they don't really know what they want to do with it now. It's and I'm aware that this probably does sound quite condescending, but that's because I am being condescending. I think these are people to whom one should condescend, because it's God, I don't even know what just more. Oh, this is exactly what you were just saying. Like, what is there even to say
Yeah.
about this? Yeah, the Capitol building got stormed, and it was kind of shit.
I think it's the weird thing of perspectives. Almost the one thing I keep coming back to is that like when there's lots of people that have been posting images of sort of the Capitol building from afar, and there's all this smoke and a large collection of bodies, and from that perspective, it does look like a war zone. But then the problem is that you zoom in closer, and it's just a frat party. And it's like that disconnection, that sort of disparity between like how this thing looks is, yeah. I mean, what wins out in the end is just the frat party vibe. And yeah, the closer you look, the more laughable and pathetic it comes. It's really and it's hard to know what to do with that other than just like it's never. I don't think there's ever been a moment where a moment that like you can't deny how unprecedented that kind of assault is on a Capitol building, but at the same time, it's like nothing so unprecedented has ever felt so pathetic. And so sort of inconsequential that it was just like a big disruption, and now everything's gone back to normal. And it's like, wow, well done. It's like what? I don't know what else there is to say. After it's like it ended, and then it's like, right, okay, great. But it feels like, I guess I wonder one of the things that maybe that's actually, I think maybe this maybe to lead us into what we actually are talking about today, and in this, I guess we should inform our listeners that we're reading the text that we're reading for basing our chat off today is the Desiring Machines. I guess it's the first section of the first chapter, which are both called both the first chapter and the first section are called Desiring Machines. Otherwise, did you read the whole thing, the whole sort of third of the book?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, right, okay.
Oh, I feel bad now because I did this all. I'd like just spent yesterday just sort of like, well, have to read 50 pages of Deleuze Guitar.
Well, no, that's great.
And it was actually, which I'm very glad to have done, obviously, because it is great. And this was because I think I said in our first episode that I read Anti-Oedipus a few years ago, and it was a very like confusing but oddly liberatory experience because it did snap me out of certain quite dark sort of like circles of thought I'd become trapped in, and going back to it, I was kind of like relieved to find that there was a lot that more I was able to take from it second time round. That there's a lot more that kind of made sense to me because I am just more generally familiar, not only with Deleuze and Guattari, but with psychoanalysis than I was when I first read this, and with post-structuralism as a movement, for as much as we can call Deleuze and Guattari post-structuralists, obviously. But there is still a lot in here which is just kind of like, is faintly baffling because they do jump. I mean, it is a joyful jumping around, but it is a jumping around all the same between different topics and different subjects and different areas. So you can get, I wouldn't say exactly get lost by it because it does all flow on from itself quite neatly, but it is also quite dizzying at the same time. In fact, I'm just going to list through the section headings of chapter 1, just to give you an idea of where we go with this. Is Section 1, Desiring Production. Section 2, The Body Without Organs. Section 3, The Subject and Enjoyment. Section 4, A Materialist Psychiatry. Section 5, The Machines. And Section 6, The Whole and Its Parts. So there's a lot that they want to cover, and it is quite polemical in a way that is actually genuinely quite refreshing. They want to do a lot with this, so they also want to do a lot in their own name. A lot of this is them trying to strike a whole new way of talking about desire and talking about the unconscious, and a way of talking about psychoanalysis partially on psychoanalysis's own terms, but also bringing a new materialist way of thinking about desire and the unconscious and mental life with them.
Yeah, I think that I guess the reason why I wanted to maybe jump in with exploring that, at least introducing this project before carrying on. Well, I mean, I guess we're going to entangle things here, but I guess the one thing that we should say is that as much as this sounds very I didn't want to say highfalutin in a kind of another condescending manner, but it all feels quite detached, I guess, from immediate concerns, at least in the way that they sort of describe their own project. But I think the opposite is true, and that's made clear at least by Michel Foucault's preface on how to live a non-fascist life, which is, I think, maybe interesting in terms of what we've seen in yesterday going around the capital. That I think there's been a quite an interesting debate, really, that people are saying, is this an inchoate fascism emerging, or is this fascism sort of dying fart as Trump leaves office? And I think it's that maybe those two perspectives, from afar seeing it as this kind of sacking of a sort of cherished democratic institution, and then the closer you get, it just feels like aggressive impotence. But I think maybe that's partly, understanding how those two perspectives can kind of correlate and how they're sort of part of the same flat circle of fascism. Is I think partly what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do here, untangling, I guess, the level of psychoanalysis. They're talking about these various symbols of, they're talking very generally, and maybe this is kind of, we'll probably have to unpack this as we go forwards, but this sense of how we express and how we recognize desire as a kind of symbolic process, maybe. The desiring machine as kind of this, in a lot of maybe a train of thought that's following us through these episodes of the podcast, that it becomes this kind of concept that's difficult to image because it's kind of pervasive, but actually recognizing it's the way that it is pervasive allows us to plug it into these different ways of understanding different things, which probably sounds like nothing, but maybe that's something that we'll have to unpack going forward. So how we can actually understand not just this text, but I guess this moment that we've kind of just witnessed.
Yes, there's two responses I want to make to that, and I will actually try and keep it to two responses because we both have tendencies towards tangents.
It's true.
Following our schizophrenic lines of flight. But yeah, so the first point I want to make is regarding specifically what you were saying, how there has been discussion about, is this an inchoate kind of like fascist fart, or is this the beginning of a new fascism? Like, I kind of... I'm not sure I recognise the dichotomy there. I don't like the implication that there is, so to speak, a coate fascism that exists as an alternative to an inchoate fascism. I think that one of the things that historians of fascism have pointed out quite famously is fascism is actually very difficult to define, that a lot of things occur under the fascist umbrella. And one of the things... Well, for example, once the Nazis actually took power, once power was seized, because the Nazis had their 20-point program, like for the new Germany, basically, which was a kind of their electoral platform, if you will. And that contained exactly the stuff you'd imagine, but also stuff that's a little bit surprising if you approach this not knowing too much about the actual nominal content of their ideology, because there's a lot of kind of like socialist or socialist adjacent ideas in there. But the first thing that happens, well, not literally, but one of the first things that happens after the seizure of power in 1933 is a proclamation is given out that says that party members are no longer allowed to discuss the 20-point program, because this is the thing, that fascism isn't coherent. It's not like Marxism, Leninism, for instance, where like there is a coherent, cogent, non-self-contradicting platform of principled philosophical and economic and social ideas which a Marxist-Leninist party enacts and uses to govern a country. Fascism is a lot more like a cohesion or a temporary cohesion of related stances and values which tend to occur together but don't necessarily directly lead into one another. Like Mussolini's fascism, for instance, presents itself as anti-capitalist sort of for a bit, and then it starts talking about how actually fascism wants a new kind of heroic capitalism or a super capitalism, and likewise in Nazi Germany, the economic policies that the Nazis had, although nominally was socialistic, or like I said, socialist adjacent at the very least, you don't really see this happening after they take power, because that wasn't ever really the point. The point was just this libidinal fury against the world and against the Jewish people in particular. So I think really when it comes to what we saw yesterday, although rightly we should laugh at these idiots who have fallen for this stupid conspiracy theory, but at the same time, fascism isn't clever, and it doesn't need clever people to be successful or to work in inverted commas obviously, or to take power and to do things, or at least to disrupt the good governance of a country. And actually this does lead into the second point. See, I said I would keep it to 2 points. And I'm actually just going to read a long passage out here from Anti-Oedipus, and this is them discussing Wilhelm Reich's work on the psychology of fascism. It's a bit lengthy, but it is worth reading the whole thing. Even the most repressive and the most deadly forms of social reproduction are produced by desire within the organisation that is the consequence of such production under various conditions that we must analyse. This is why the fundamental problem of political philosophy is still precisely the one that Spinoza saw so clearly and that Wilhelm Reich rediscovered. Why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? How can people possibly reach the point of shouting, more taxes, less bread? As Reich remarks, the astonishing thing is not that some people steal or that others occasionally go out on strike, but rather that all those who are starving do not steal as a regular practice, and all those who are exploited are not continually out on strike. After centuries of exploitation, why do people still tolerate being humiliated and enslaved, to such a point indeed that they actually want humiliation and slavery not only for others but for themselves? Reich is at his profoundest as a thinker when he refuses to accept ignorance or illusion on the part of the masses as an explanation of fascism, and demands an explanation that will take their desires into account, an explanation formulated in terms of desire. No, the masses were not innocent dupes. At a certain point, under a certain set of conditions, they wanted fascism, and it is this perversion of the desire of the masses that needs to be accounted for. And really, doesn't that just hit the nail really beautifully on the head? And does actually obviously contradicts things I was just saying now, how these people are idiots who we should laugh at. But I will actually maintain that they are idiots and we should laugh at them. Yes, but I mentioned how these idiots have fallen for this conspiracy theory, and again they are idiots who have fallen for a conspiracy theory. But at the same time, stuff like QAnon and all of the paranoia, the baseless paranoia around who actually won the presidential election, and so on. These are manifestations of a very, very powerful desiring machine that has taken root. And I am aware that we're about quarter of an hour into this and we haven't actually defined what a desiring machine is. Right. We are going to. But this is, and it's almost quite an obvious answer, really, when we say, why do these people do this? And the answer is because they want Donald Trump to be their president. They desire that. And it is a pre-rational wanting and yearning that is being expressed, and it is being expressed sincerely and authentically, whatever that means. It isn't that honestly, no, it isn't that they're stupid. It's that this is what that desire ultimately can only lead to.
Yeah, I think there's two things that not 2 points, but maybe at least 2 connections that I see in your 2 points, that maybe give us a good foundation to really dive into this text and define our terms a bit. Because I really I agree with you when you say that there's this problem with defining a beginning of fascism, or an inchoate fascism. And I think that's partly what Deleuze and Guattari are kind of interrogating in this text, this understanding of origins, or where things supposedly start. And I think maybe one of those I think in a way that's the that's what maybe the most rudimentary way to understand the significance of the title of this book, Anti-Oedipus. Who is Oedipus? But the sort of well, it's the tragic tale in its. I mean, there's lots of different. Again, we can get really bogged down just in approaching Oedipus, but maybe at least to keep it simple-ish. I think, as we all know, the story of Oedipus as being the tragic story of a man who doesn't know where he comes from, goes to try and find out his origins, to find out who his father and mother are, and in that process, kind of ends up killing his father and marrying his mother, and then the curse that results from that incest dooms his family for generations. And there's this kind of, I think that there's a really interesting, what Deleuze and Guattari take from that, I think, is a really interesting parable that searching for our origins can lead us to, believe in very dangerous falsehoods. And actually pursuing origins in itself as a process, as an endeavor, is very risky. So I think that what they do is they jettison that as a project altogether. We don't understand fascism by trying to pinpoint the exact moment it emerges, but rather just understand that fascism is a feedback loop. It's a chicken and the egg situation. And I guess the egg is kind of a symbol that we kind of will probably come to in discussing this chapter later on. But it's in trying to. I mean, I think, again, I don't want to actually preload this with too much more complex sort of ways of describing these different concepts, but I guess what they're saying in a way is that this chicken and egg of ideology, if not just fascism, is a kind of to try and solve the riddle is to miss the point. It's understanding how an egg that is this, for Deleuze and Guattari's kind of plane of consistency, is kind of restricted and boxed up and enters a symbolic order and becomes a chicken. But a chicken is also always capable of producing another egg, another kind of unformed, unarticulated mess in a way. But there's great potential in that, and it's kind of always getting back to that moment of potential. And I guess what defines fascism, in the way that you described it just then, I guess, is that it has no beginning or end, but it affirms itself through these kind of narratives, right? These kind of mythic narratives of origin and goals, rather than focusing on its own process. And in this chapter, Deleuze and Guattari, or in the whole book, really, and even in their whole oeuvre, you could say, that I think is a considerable kind of issue that lingers over their entire project. That it's it's not just the way that we understand processes, not in terms of themselves, but in terms of the goals that they are towards. And there's a certain fallacy in there that we have to be very vigilant of.
Yes, I think what you were saying there about birth and the search for origins having a kind of implicit danger to it is a really interesting point there. And it's interesting actually that one political theorist, Roger Griffin, who's a historian and theorist of fascism, has offered as a definition of fascism, or the notion being this, like the most generic possible theory of fascism, that it is palingenetic ultranationalism, which is a wonderful phrase. But palingenesis meaning literally to be born again, rebirth. So there is this sense almost that fascism is this is something that we always see when we talk to reactionaries, to sort of like to extremely right-wing people, and what we see when we hear of these people speak, that there is this appeal to an idealized past they want to return to, and that trajectory can only lead back into wanting to climb back inside the womb, to the state of the removal of all distinctions between you and the world, and the removal of all blocks on your ability to get what you want, whilst whilst your desires also infantilize themselves to become progressively less complicated. And you see this all the time, with the kind of language that is often used by right-wing politicians, and especially populist politicians, with their sort of demands. What is implicit in a lot of what they say is the idea that things are basically simple and don't trust the people who say it's complicated, because again, what people want is to go. The desire that I think is weaponized a lot of the time by fascism is that desire to go back to go back to when things were comfortable and made sense in a way they don't now.
Mm-hmm. I think saying that, I'm going to adopt the position of podcast fascist and say that actually we are. I think what we're doing here is maybe starting very much in the thick of things, but I wonder if it's actually worth going back to some kind of terminological origin and maybe backtracking a little bit, because I kind of think that one thing that's worth clarifying here is how psychoanalysis fits into this, and then maybe because that even just sounds like a non sequitur given what we're talking about, but I guess for Deleuze and Guattari that's kind of the framework that they're working in, and precisely because I think that's this is the issue with Oedipus. Oedipus being the Oedipus complex being the most famous kind of concept or process to come out of psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis in itself is the kind of study of human origins, maybe, or not human origins, but the origins of subjectivity at least. And I think
shall we?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that perhaps before we do, because you're right, we should get down to it and start talking about desiring machines. But before we do that, is it worth spending a little bit of time just clarifying exactly what the Oedipus complex is, just so we do have a nice little definition of that?
Well, this is partly where there is some. I guess that's partly where there's tension here, because I think that there's the one thing that, at least if we situate Deleuze and Guattari and say that they are coming in at this book was written in the early. I think it's the early 70s, or is it the late 60s? I always forget. Actually,
I'll check. I've got my copy.
It's. Oh no, wait.
72.
72, yeah. So, which is, as far as we're talking about the history of psychoanalysis, it's fairly late. And really, what I think there's a lot of dealing with Freud in both this text and A Thousand Plateaus, but I think in a lot of ways what Deleuze and Guattari are kind of dealing with is a more Lacanian version of psychoanalysis, precisely because Lacan is that kind of, I guess, it's already there's this kind of temporal tangle. But maybe to just, at least if we're going to define the Oedipus complex, at least for Freud, the Oedipus complex is this kind of it's a kind of recognition of your own place within, I guess, a social milieu. Freud kind of argues that the Oedipus complex is when a child kind of becomes somewhat self-aware, or not self-aware, but no, I'm mixing up my Lacanian and my Freudian here. Well, he argues that it's a process that begins at the start, around the ages of like 4 or 5, which the age is important, I think, at least for Freud. And it's the kind of moment where you pass through the veil of being this kind of unformed subject and start to realize where you sit within a broader kind of context. So you kind of it's defined most famously as like this desire for the mother and a kind of fear or antagonism towards the father, as if to say there's a jealousy of the father towards the mother's attention. But I think it's kind of more complicated than that. For I think what's often left out of Freud, at least, is that Oedipus becomes central for him because when he was initially, basically birthing psychoanalysis, he was seeing a lot of these tense family dynamics in the kind of bourgeoisie of Vienna in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And I think one thing that's often was, at least for a long time, left out is that Freud often writes about nursemaids, and that a lot of these bourgeois families would actually not be constituted like the nuclear family that we know it today. There would be this other figure who would often complicate these relations, sexual relations often, and often these kind of this developmental process where you kind of have two mothers, and the father's relationship to nursemaid and actual mother can be really complex. And so Freud's kind of trying to deal with, he himself was raised mostly by his nursemaid. I think it's him both trying to deal with his own complicated relationships towards the women in his life, and also how he was seeing a lot of these kind of things happen with other children around him. And there's a lot of frustration that emerges from, as psychoanalysis builds, there's a lot of frustration that emerges from that concept, because in that respect, Freud's worldview is pretty blinkered. He's trying to basically understand the tensions that are pervasive within bourgeois society. But in making that general, he kind of extrapolates the bourgeois into all aspects of society. This is the source of Deleuze and Guattari's main kind of issue with psychoanalysis, and why they are actually kind of, they're so far along in this that they're often associated with an anti-psychiatry movement. And Deleuze, in particular, kind of notes this as coming from a lot of other earlier figures, actually particularly D.H. Lawrence, which I've actually always found quite fascinating. But he notes how there's, they've got reservations with regards to psychoanalysis, because it doesn't stem from this, like, the horror of discovering what real sexuality is, because I guess that's how it's understood, right? That the Oedipus complex is the birth of sexuality, and that impulse is first directed towards the mother and against the father. But really what Freud did especially, and what they're trying to undo, is this sense that psychoanalysis actually shuts up sexuality. And this is a quote from them. It shuts up sexuality in a bizarre sort of box painted with bourgeois motifs. So Oedipus for them becomes just another sort of construct that doesn't actually have any sort of material relation, or the actual material relations that are at play in Oedipus are what Freud actually erases a lot of the time. So this is why, a long story, I'm rambling again, as is often for this podcast, but I think this is partly why it's worth emphasizing Lacan here more than Freud. Because what Lacan kind of introduces into psychoanalysis by, again, in that kind of paradoxical sense of returning to Freud, having this sort of great return after a lot of Freud's theories had kind of been challenged and debunked, but Freud nevertheless goes back to that origin because he loves origins, and kind of untangles what actually happens prior to Oedipus, at least for Freud. So that's when Freud kind of comes up with the mirror stage as being this when a child, which is kind of quite famous now, is used in just generally in child development, actually, which I actually find quite interesting. But it's that moment when a child can look in the mirror and not just recognize themselves, but recognize those, they recognize themselves in the mirror, and that allows them to see other people, like the mother, like the father, as others. Whereas, immediately at birth, you could argue that a child doesn't actually see any subjective difference between their mother and themselves. Mother and child are one as they were in the womb. And so Lacan's kind of further, embellishing this process of kind of a maternal distinction, the distinction between mother and child, and how that is the first step towards actually constituting yourself as a subject. But this is kind of where we get this basically that realization complicates everything in psychoanalysis for Lacan. And I think one thing that I remember seeing this in your notes, where we were initially sort of saying maybe we discuss libido and death drive, at least via Freud, but I think it's more important to do it from Lacan, because what Lacan kind of discovers in this mother-child relation is that the death drive is fundamentally rethought. It's not that we're trying to return to a kind of primal inorganicity, to return to the womb, or return to that kind of stillness that is just immediately prior to life. But he centers the very impossibility of doing that. So it's not the death drive. Then death is not the same as being unborn. So we're actually the very paradox of that relation makes the death drive this kind of constant circling around an unattainable lack, and therefore it produces repetition. And what that means is that, in Freud's own terms, in a weird way, every drive is a death drive, because every drive, whether it's not just a death drive, but life drives themselves or any other kind of pleasure principle, performance principle, whatever kind of you want to pick out the chocolate box of Freudian psychoanalysis, every single one of those things is a drive that pursues its own extinction and therefore involves the repetition of its own pursuit, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that's a really, really, really good summary of where we're starting from here. Just for the sake of hearing the sound of my own voice for a moment, actually, I'm going to. I just remember actually a moment from a very good horror movie called The Void. Have you seen it by any chance?
I haven't. I actually think you recommended me this for Halloween, and I didn't get around to watching it. But it's like very close to my list of things to watch.
It's really good fun, and it's not a spoiler, but there's a bit where they find this. In this hospital, they find this room of basically of the living dead, of zombies, and there's one particular image that really stuck with me, which I think is a very good illustration of what it is you're saying here. Is that one of these like undead is trying to kill itself, and it is doing so by ramming its skull against this pipe sticking out of a wall, and you can see that there's this like void in its head now, where it's been doing that for so long to try and kill itself without dying because it is undead, which is something horrible image. And I think that's exactly. But I think one of the thing that is so horrific about that is exactly what you were just saying. There is the repetition of it, is and the unendingness of the repetition, that it is seeking. In this case, the lack it is trying to resolve is its own death. It wants to die and it can't because it is death already, or it is undead. But what you see, in that gesture of it continually throwing its head against a pipe, you get that the illustration here, that like the point for Lacan is the repetition, is the deathliness of the repetition almost. But without further ado, being over half an hour into this podcast about the desiring machines, Matt, what are desiring machines?
Well, I guess that's a really good segue, because I guess the one thing I'd want to emphasize in that image that you've horrifically painted is that I guess the one thing that comes to my mind in imagining it is that it's not about life or death. If what's being voided or attempted to be voided in that repetition is the subject. When we die, things don't just, they stop for us as conscious beings, but things in themselves don't stop. We kind of become a part of nature, right? That we disappear and dissolve into soil and become worm and plant foods, but we kind of then enter into another process. And I think that's partly what Deleuze and Guattari are getting back to in talking about desiring machines. A desiring machine is the use of machine is important because it kind of suggests this kind of inorganicness or an unnaturalness. But actually what they're suggesting here and trying to emphasize is that it's all machines. The organ, that we can understand the body as a machine, and we can understand anything as a machine, essentially. I guess the reason for mentioning before about this thing about the death drive, that every drive is a death drive, is what that means is that it kind of stops any kind of drive or desire itself having anything to do with biology. So whilst we kind of can understand, and this is something that's true in Marx too, actually, which is maybe worth emphasizing here. I think maybe I mentioned this in another podcast or either another podcast or another episode of our podcast. But something I've written on before is that there's this shift in how Marx understands desire, where initially he talks about it as being like a hunger, like a biological longing. I want to eat food because my body's telling me. And actually then, through his analysis of capitalism, he understands desire later as this unattained, kind of in a Lacanian way almost. He's sort of saying that it's not the sating of a natural hunger, but just a constant pushing forwards, that desire is never exhausted. If we attain something that we like, we will always attain something else. We're never hungry just once. We constantly have that same desire. And that in a way kind of makes, for maybe Marx at his most Gothic, and especially for Deleuze and Guattari, that makes desire machinic in the same way that capitalism is machinic. And part of the horror, but also the kind of insight of them talking about machines, is that if you can't distinguish between what they call an organ machine or an organic machine and the actual machines of capitalism, that's because as far as capitalism is concerned, there's no difference anyway. That's kind of a very basic way of saying what a design machine is, but then we're kind of only really at the start. Part of the question that comes next is, why bother thinking in that way? That sounds kind of, why take on the perspective of capital? And what does that actually allow us to, how does that allow us to approach the world in a different way? Is that even worthwhile? Is that not just kind of an intellectual complicity, maybe?
I think what's worth taking from the imagery they use of machines and their emphasis that it's all machines all the way down is they're emphasizing a kind of continuity of desire, and especially, and this is actually, I know we've been talking a lot about Lacan and desire, and we talked about lack just now, but they don't like thinking of desire in terms of lack. They think that is a bad way of thinking about desire.
Yes.
Instead, what they call for is a understanding of desire which is basically productive. The idea that desire isn't predicated on there being a lack that it needs to fulfill. Desire produces, and what desire produces is it produces production. It is without having to, again, it's one of those things where it's difficult to know how to articulate it because you're going against our normal ways of thinking about these things.
I think maybe that's the point of talking about hunger. At least that's why I mentioned the fact that we're never hungry once, because it's like, it's not to say that you are hungry because you lack food, but actually when you eat food, like, you gain that, and then your body kind of churns it up and turns it into energy. So you always need to replenish energy. So I guess it's in that, in a very literal way, it's like that's kind of takes lack out of the equation, because it's not about the fact that you don't have or you want food, but that eating food produces production, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It's digestion,
yes, exactly,
that makes you hungry. So the production of energy requires more fuel, and that's not lack. That's just a cycle. That's the feedback loop, right?
Yes, there's a, and I think. And one of the things to bear in mind when it comes to reading this book is how wonderfully imagistic it is. The language they use is extremely evocative. Like I said earlier, it's quite polemical in a very refreshing way. And again, I'm just going to bore everybody by reading a passage here, but I think this does actually a really good job of indicating exactly what they mean when they talk about it all being machines, and what I meant there when I talked about there being a continuum of desire that encompasses all of it. A schizophrenic out for a walk is a better model than a neurotic lying on an analyst's couch. A breath of fresh air, a relationship with the outside world. Lenz's stroll, for example, as reconstructed by Büchner. This walk outdoors is different from the moments when Lenz finds himself closeted with his pastor, who forces him to situate himself socially in relationship to the god of established religion, in relationship to his father, to his mother. While taking a stroll outdoors, on the other hand, he is in the mountains, amid falling snowflakes, with other gods or without any gods at all, without a family, without a father or a mother, with nature. What does my father want? Can he offer me more than that? Impossible. Leave me in peace. Everything is a machine, celestial machines. The stars are all rainbows in the sky, alpine machines, all of them connected to those of his body, the continual whir of machines. To be a chlorophyll or photosynthesis machine, or at least slip his body into such machines as one part among the others. Lenz has projected himself back to a time before the man-nature dichotomy, before all the coordinates based on this fundamental dichotomy had been laid down. He does not live nature, but as a process of production. There's no such thing as either man or nature now, only a process that produces the one within the other and couples the machines together. producing machines, desiring machines everywhere, schizophrenic machines, all of species life. The self and the non-self, outside and inside, no longer have any meaning whatsoever. So I think that in some ways the language and the imagery of machines is quite easy to understand here, because when the Guattari are talking about ourselves, for as much as we have selves, being situated within the processes of desiring production, machinic desire, which isn't just us ourselves as isolated individuals with our wants and our needs and our desires and our longings, but rather as components within the great endless series of machines all coupled with one another. Because one of the things they emphasize is that there is never an isolated desiring machine. Desiring machines are always at least binary, one plugged into another. And in so doing, it gives us a whole different way of understanding what desire actually is, and recognizing that desire isn't individual, desire isn't even social, desire is cosmo-machinic, so to speak. That there, in a very real way, there isn't a point where my desire ends and the desire of the plants and the animals begins. That the machinery of this is literally endless. And what's interesting as well is they insist that when they talk about machines, they are not talking about metaphorical machines. They say that no, this is literally machinic at every stage and point of existence. It is machines, because they state that a machine can be defined simply as a block or a cutting or a flow. And as they say, desire is certainly real, desire exists and exists as flows, then the breaks and blockages and diversions and cuttings up of that flow constitute machinic elements. And as, again, as you said, they explicitly deny distinctions between the individual and the social, and between the social and the human and the natural. This produces a machinic cosmos where everything is flows of desire moving through celestial machines and earth machines. They talk about the sun there and the chlorophyll in the plants, how there is a direct connection, literally a direct, not metaphorical connection between the machinic processes of the sun as it generates light energy and the chemical machines, the chlorophyll machines inside a blade of grass that use the sunlight to produce nourishment for the plant and to continue to grow. That there's a direct flow coming from the one to the other, and then from that one to the cow that eats it, and then the person who eats the cow, and the shit from the person, and the nutrients from the shit that produces new plant life, and so on. That there isn't a stop to this at any point. It is a continuousness of noisy desiring machines.
Yeah, and I think that's like, it's one of my favorite passages in anything that they've written. I think where they talk about Georg Büchner's Lenz, Lenz being like the titular character of this sort of. I've seen it described as a novella fragment, which I don't know what that means. Is that different to a short story or something else? But
it's a short story, but fancy.
Yeah. But yeah, it's this like I guess what is introduced here, right, is this strange way that, again, I don't want to separate out Guattari, but to me this all just sounds like Deleuze 101 in a way, that he has this fascination here with the clinical and the critical. So we're talking about schizophrenia, and I guess that's what's so important about that, really. It's one of the most famous lines, I think, in this whole book. A schizophrenic out for a walk is a better model than a neurotic on an analyst's couch. And I think what's worth emphasizing about those two things, right, is that in what happens in that sentence is that we can understand schizophrenia as its own kind of pathology, as a medical diagnosis, but here in that very sentence, they're placing the schizophrenic outside of the medical industrial complex. We could even call it that, or at least even the sort of the psychoanalytic process. It's neurotics lie on couches. Schizophrenics are not part of that system. That's the thing with Lenz, the character in Buchner's, I don't know, I'm going to butcher pronunciations. That's why we're here. Buchner's novella fragment, or whatever. I really hate that phrase. But yeah, so anyway, when Lenz, the character in Buchner's novel, is out for his walk, the way that Buchner describes it's really quite astoundingly not simplistic, but I mean condensed. Buchner actually articulates, I think, what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do here even better than they do. And I'm surprised they kind of don't draw on this quote in particular, where Buchner writes that while Lenz is out for his stroll, he could not grasp why it took so much time to clamber down a slope to reach a distant point. He was convinced he could cover it all with a pair of strides. And I think that's what really throws people off about Deleuze and Guattari more generally, and why I kind of prefaced my insistence we step back with being this sort of podcast fascist, right? Because I mean, part of the whole reason of it, we struggle to actually make sense of these things without starting from the beginning, without going back to origins, and sort of allowing ourselves to catch up. But I think the point for Deleuze and Guattari really is that that's not the only way of doing things. If you are schizophrenic, you don't need that kind of. I guess what it is really is it's kind of like epistemic structure. You don't need to go from A to B to C to D to E to F to G. You just go from A to Z in a stride, and it seems wholly irrational to do that. But actually, again, I guess this kind of comes back to why they talk about desiring machines, because in a way that's what capital does for us. And that's kind of the paradox here, I think, and the reason for mentioning this whole sort of critical clinical thing, that Deleuze and Guattari are exploring a clinical diagnosis here as it was a literary theory. And I don't think that's quite the same as a Derridian sense that schizophrenia is a text, but rather that we can make that stride. There's nothing. It doesn't mean that everything is a book, but that everything can at least be described in the terms of other disciplines, and that's actually a really important way of understanding the structures that are in place to kind of to compartmentalize things in our world. And what's ironic about this, and maybe related to fascism, in at least sort of saying that fascism is that feedback loop that nevertheless relies on the story it tells of its own development in a kind of heroic sense, is that this is how capitalism works too. So I guess to say that to say that the human body and the factory. I mean, there's a couple of quotes I think in here where they do that, right? They draw from literary, whether it's Burroughs or D.H. Lawrence or Bucher or other people. It's on. Who is this a quote by? I can't find the note. But from the book Malone Dies, they have a quote where they say, "Under the skin, the body is an overheated factory, and outside, the invalid shines, glows from every burst pore." And the very fact that the literary does that so readily, that kind of, it's not a simile. It's it's to describe the body itself on the inside as an overheated factory, to kind of conflate those scales, to show how capitalism is kind of within us, that as much as we are workers, we are cogs in the machine, we are machines in ourselves. We can unpack that structure as Marx did, and write volumes and volumes about how each cog and nut and bolt is related to one another. But the schizophrenic has no need to do that. We can say the body is an overheated factory and it makes sense, or at least to the schizophrenic it does, and to capitalism it does. So I guess there's this tension that kind of is difficult here, where it's like they are not. I guess the one thing that needs to be emphasized is that they're not saying that schizophrenia as a kind of clinical diagnosis is something that we should all be trying to acquire, but we can at least understand it as like a critical, not a clinical, but a critical framework for understanding the world. Because in seeing nature as the schizophrenic does, as a process of production, as the production of production, we're seeing nature capitalistically, And that's where I think, as you said before, that this understanding of desire as a lack that Lacan has is actually insufficient. I mean, I think it's clear that they agree. They flatten the distinction that Lacan places on nature and culture, because whilst it's right to say that, as Lacan does, every drive is a death drive, he nevertheless still retains hold of Oedipus. So, as I kind of was saying before, his work is, like psychoanalysis as a whole, is concerned with origins above all else. So the question becomes, in actually seeing ourselves schizophrenically or capitalistically, we're actually kind of just seeing ourselves as part of nature. And as far as capitalism is concerned, that's seeing everything as potential fuel for itself. But what that means for us is that we can better understand that the production of production, the chicken and the egg scenario, where the egg is that body without organs, right? It's that plane of consistency. It's that mixed up, indistinguishable, unformed, unmolded subject. Whereas the chicken is a chicken. The chicken is kind of the subject inserted into a socio-symbolic order. And so in that way, that you reject the notion of an origin, and in doing that, you fuck up Freud and Lacan in one step by focusing precisely on that kind of what Oedipus is in that sense is a traversal. Oedipus is the kind of primal figure of being thrust into the symbolic order, as Lacan calls it, or as being understood as a cog in that capitalist machine. It's kind of like that this is the age that you become a subject, that you even become a worker, that you become part of this overarching capitalistic production mechanism. And if you want to reject that process of traversal, you want to try and deconstruct our understanding of becoming subjects through becoming parts of capitalism, you have to then see the world as schizophrenic, because if you're gonna reject the nature of origins, then you have to be anti-Oedipal. You have to be anti-Oedipus. But again, I think the one thing that I want to emphasize, at least before I shut up again for a minute, is that I think what I'm trying to kind of give a foundation to is that when they're pushing for the schizophrenic, they're not talking about some wholly irrational pursuit where everything is collapsed together and everything's just a big jumble without any meaning. I think that what they're actually doing in a way is they're kind of trying to excavate what we see as the irrationality of capitalism and actually show how, salvage it almost, and show how that kind of thinking has a history within philosophy for an actual, as being a foundation for rationalism. And that's where Spinoza becomes really important, I think, for Deleuze especially, and also for Deleuze and Guattari. There's a point in Anti-Oedipus where they start talking about how the collapse of this distinction between man and nature produces the homo natura, and as I said, this is, or it should be, the principal concern for materialist psychiatry. And this is what makes that's almost a Spinozist argument. I think we talked about this when we were talking about the body without organs. For Spinoza, his heretical and supposedly atheistic perspective of the world is that he sees production, as Deleuze and Guattari do, as naturing. And I think what's important about that is that, at least in terms of psychiatry, and understanding how we kind of function in the world, in a capitalist world at least, is that maybe I'm going too far. Maybe I'll actually stop there. Maybe that's something. Maybe that's a thing I want to pick up, because I'm going to go further down a rabbit hole here, which I think we should do. But I really want to see what you have to say actually about that ramble, if anything.
Yes.
Kind of
I've got a couple of things that I do want to talk about. And I think going back to the figure of Oedipus and its relation with capital, I think one of the ways that we should understand what's going on here when they talk about, especially because they talk about how Oedipus is a triangulation of desire. And a great deal of what's going on in this book, and the clues in the name, is them attacking the notion that the Oedipal triangle is this universal perennial feature of desire and the unconscious. So I think I might be taking actually a slightly different tack to, not necessarily contradictory, but I think a slightly different approach to this that you were taking there, Matt, whereby, because I think one of the things to be emphasised in Freud, and I know that we've already talked about the complexity of whose Freud is being talked about here, is it Lacan's Freud or Freud's Freud, but one of the things that Freud at least does state is that for him the shibboleth of psychoanalysis is Oedipus. That is the word he uses at one point, or maybe he says shibboleth in German. But he is absolutely insistent of this, that that is the foundational claim of psychoanalysis, that the Oedipus complex is the defining psychosexual trauma that every individual goes through, including individuals who, in a certain sense, do not go through it, because then their unconscious life and their life of desire has to be understood through the lens of a kind of a negative Oedipus complex, so to speak, of not having undergone the Oedipal trauma, and thus that's why they're fucked up in that particular way, because they didn't get fucked up by Oedipus, they got fucked up by not Oedipus, but it's still relating it back to Oedipus. And so what the schizophrenic does for Deleuze-Guattari, and I will actually read the quote here, it's only a short one, don't worry. We may well ponder the possibility that the analytic imperialism of the Oedipus complex led Freud to rediscover and to lend all the weight of his authority to the unfortunate misapplication of the concept of autism to schizophrenia. For we must not delude ourselves. Freud doesn't like schizophrenics. He doesn't like their resistance to being Oedipalized, and tends to treat them more or less as animals. They mistake words for things, he says. They are apathetic, narcissistic, cut off from reality, incapable of achieving transference. They resemble philosophers, quote, an undesirable resemblance. I like that. And I think what they're saying there is that, and I want to talk about their use of the word autism there, because I think this is the clinical understanding of what autism is was different in the 70s to what it is now, where there is and the term autism is used more or less exclusively to refer to people we would now describe as being severely autistic, with an extremely reduced ability to communicate and ability to be social. And while we now use a broader definition of autism, I'm actually diagnosed on the autistic spectrum myself, which I'm sure will be a surprise to absolutely no one. And I think what they're saying there is that this allocation of autism to the schizophrenic misses the point entirely, because what Freud seems to think is that the schizophrenic is so hopeless because the schizophrenic is completely cut off from reality and from the machinery of the socius, and as such they're totally inward and can only speak their own kind of like private language almost. There's nothing of the social to them, there's nothing of the communicative to them. But what Deleuze-Guattari instead assert is actually the opposite is the case, and the schizophrenic is someone for whom the connections are overwhelmingly real, and far more so than they are for a normal Oedipalized subject, because that's like in the passage that I read from earlier, Lenz out for a stroll, he finds himself kind of like conversing with the celestial machines, and with the raindrop machines and the flower machines and the earth machines, and he doesn't like it when the pastor tries to make him understand his desires solely in terms of mother and father and God. That's not what he's interested in, because he has discovered naturing as the production of production, and he's immersed himself in that machinery of desire and the machinery of production, and has found his own personal desiring machines, thoroughly plugged into them, and he wills that. He's enjoying that. That's the experience he wants. And what that rejects, though, is Oedipal imperialism. It rejects Oedipus as such, because for the schizophrenic doesn't give a shit about mummy and daddy. The schizophrenic absolutely rejects the idea that their origin is in mother and father. because they have understood that nothing has an origin because it's all machines, and in the same way, nothing has an end because it's all machines. It is that. And yeah, they talk about, and I think this might be something we talk about a little bit more detail later, possibly. But Deleuze and Guattari talk about how the subject, the self, is a peripheral kind of like component of the desiring machines. It's not in the center at all. There's this kind of like rambling thing that exists on the level of the inscription machine, which is something we should define later. So and how this relates to capital is because what capital does in a very basic way to production understood in industrial terms and agricultural terms and commercial terms is it insists that all production be carried out through the prism of capital, whereby all production is ultimately aimed at the generation of surplus value, the generation of capital. And what this does, obviously, is it completely rejects all the other possibilities that are inherent to production. In the same way that Oedipus, the tyranny of Oedipus, completely rejects all of the other possibilities of desire and the way that desire is triangulated and formulated that are actually inherent to us and implicit in the desiring machines. And they go on to point out, actually, it's shortly after the passage I just read, the great discovery of psychoanalysis was that of the production of desire, of the productions of the unconscious. But once Oedipus entered the picture, this discovery was soon buried under a new brand of idealism. A classical theatre was substituted for the unconscious as a factory. Representation was substituted for the units of production of the unconscious, and an unconscious that was capable of nothing but expressing itself in myth, tragedy, dreams was substituted for the productive unconscious. And again, I think this is wonderful imagery, and I think this is a really important thing they're saying here, because the Freudian unconscious makes itself known through the imagery of classical mythology, which of course Freud was very, very knowledgeable of. Hence Oedipus is, hence why he names it Oedipus, right? But what Deleuze and Guattari is saying here is that the possibilities inherent to the unconscious are in principle limitless, because the unconscious kind of like understands that there aren't beginnings, there aren't ends. There's just the flows in the machines, and the unconscious imaged as a factory rather than as a theatre of representations is what kind of like emphasizes that, because the unconscious makes things. It doesn't represent itself with images like a puppet theatre where the puppets represent things or something like that. It's a work. It makes things because desires are real, and if desires are real and are made, then they aren't representative of something. They're simply real.
Yeah, I think I think in a way that's partly why. I think that's partly what Freud misses in a way. I think that's kind of what they're. I like the bit where you drew out that they say that Freud doesn't like schizophrenics because they don't fit into this. I guess the point to be made, right, is that Freud doesn't like schizophrenics because they don't fit into Freudian psychoanalysis. I think that's what's interesting and sort of why I feel like it's more important to emphasize Lacan over Freud, because if we're talking about which Oedipus or which Freud rather, Lacan's Freud or Freud's Freud, that's kind of the very paradox of Freud's Freud is, I think, what Deleuze and Guattari are kind of rejecting, that psychoanalysis in a way, and this is something that I've been researching a fair amount over the last year of the how Oedipus complex developed as a concept, and that the way that it kind of developed after Freud was precisely because whether it was Anna Freud, Freud's own daughter, or people like Melanie Klein or Lacan or Deleuze and Guattari, or others like I think this is what's important is this is a an issue that comes out from Anna Freud and Melanie Klein is this kind of feminist psychoanalysis where Freud's kind of stuck gazing at his own navel, and it's the kind of that what Deleuze and Guattari call that closed box painted with bourgeois motifs is kind of what has to be broken out of, and that means breaking Freud out from Freud. And I think that's partly, I think that when how knowledgeable Freud was of Greek mythology. I mean, probably knowledgeable, but I don't know how great a reader he was of it, because it often feels like what he recognizes in Oedipus is himself, and that's partly the part of the issue. I think that it's very insightful, but he's still kind of stuck pondering how he himself fits or does not fit into these kind of ideas of the family. That's the point earlier of raising the fact that he's raised by a nursemaid, and that was common within a lot of bourgeois families in Vienna. That that's what, Oedipus signifies, that transversal over the line into a set of social structures that are in themselves repressive. So Oedipus, and this is kind of, I think, what I wanted to go on to actually, is that I guess too, when you sort of saying that the thing about the schizophrenia and autism, again, it always has to be emphasized, I think, because it starts to make Deleuze and Guattari seem ignorant, but I think they're precisely trying to they're always trying to get away from the clinical understanding. Clinically, we understand schizophrenia and autism in far more detail, but they have no interest in that regardless. It's all about what that means as a critical framework, and whether you can understand autism in a rudimentary sense as being, as having that certain it kind of being a mirror of the same problems that the schizophrenic has, right? That if you are a sort of primary part of the of autism being that you struggle to, clinically this is anyway, at least you maybe struggle to understand your own emotions, or you struggle to recognize social cues, this sort of thing. And I guess for Deleuze and Guattari, in a way, what they're saying is that's fine. That it's the fact that actually when you consider how other people, like people that are schizophrenic or on the autism spectrum, don't fit neatly into these structures that we have for social interaction, doing so only illuminates that structural nature, if that makes sense. The fact that these people, the people that are on these different spectrums, struggle to conform only exacerbates how much we rely on conformity to our own detriment. And I think that's kind of, if the autistic subject struggles to connect with those structures, the schizophrenic connects with them all too readily, like a pinball machine, and kind of just flies over them and folds them all together. And it's the fact that we kind of place impositions on either of those ways of relating to this kind of broader. I guess it's partly the point I'm trying to make is that it says a lot about how we treat clinical schizophrenics and the autistic. Says more about the kind of restrictions and repressions of the system that we are comparing them to. Anyway, so but I guess the point of that I kind of stopped at before, at least, which I think is wholly relevant to this conversation in a way, is that this is kind of where Spinoza comes in with his understanding of emotions, and the kind of strange paradox that comes from rationally understanding emotions that Spinoza's trying to do. I think we've mentioned this before. Maybe it's Mark Fisher sort of argued that Spinoza was psychoanalysis 300 years early, but he actually does a better job of tackling these problems than Freud does, I think, in a lot of ways. And it kind of comes into this. I guess there's a at least to start, there's this line that I really like from Spinoza's Ethics, where he's talking about the freedom from passions, or it's kind of like it sounds like a kind of acquiescence, but actually what he's talking about is kind of having a sort of not even self-control or self-mastery, but self-understanding, I think, is what he's kind of aiming for as a kind of rationalist pursuit. And he kind of talks about how, and this is a quote, if we form a clear and distinct idea of an emotion, this idea will not be distinguished from the emotion itself insofar as it was related to the mind alone, which is a complex little sentence, but I'll try and unpack it. And he continues and he says, therefore, the better we know an emotion, the more it is placed within our abilities and less passive the mind is in relation to it. And I think what's central about that suggestion coming from the 1700s, which is kind of amazing, really, I think, is that Spinoza's emphasizing that emotions, as we understand them, are ideas. And that's kind of what Deleuze and Guattari apply to Freudian psychoanalysis, that Oedipus is an idea. And this is again a quote from Anti-Oedipus. They say that Oedipus is not a state of desire or the drives. It is an idea, nothing but an idea that repression inspires in us concerning desire. Not even a compromise, but an idea in the service of repression, its propaganda or its propagation. And I think how this relates to capitalism and ideology. And again, I guess just to re-emphasize the point that I think that Oedipus as an idea symbolizes that the traversal from unformed subject to kind of member of society is the beginning of that subjectivation process. Is that it kind of melts us away into understanding how the brain can work, right? Like I guess that's the thing that Spinoza says, right? That the idea will not be distinguished from the emotion itself. No, wait, sorry. The better we know an emotion, the more it is placed within our abilities, and less pervasive the mind is in relation to it. And I think I have a kind of a personal story in relation to this, which I think it's something that I've thought about a lot over reading Mark Fisher's work, which I think one of Mark's most famous kind of talking points was the suggestion that like depression isn't this individual experience. It's something that is socially produced by capitalism. We can treat depression on an individual level by prescribing therapy and especially prescribing medication, but we don't tackle the kind of the social version of it. And that sounds like kind of, I think to many people who aren't, I think it sounds to many people like a bit of a sort of wishy-washy deferral of responsibility, as if to say, I'm not responsible for how I feel. It's socially, it's a social imposition. But I think what Spinoza suggests in this sense is that it's understanding how individual emotions are kind of structural inhibitions. And I kind of understood this properly for myself. About a year or two ago, I was in like a really deep depression, and depression, I realized for me, manifests as guilt. And I didn't know what that really meant. And it doesn't really, that sounds maybe a bit silly, but I actually went to my GP and had a mental health assessment. And when they were asking me how I was experiencing this depression, one of the first questions they asked was, do you feel guilt? Not just, do you feel guilt in general towards doing something bad, but do you just feel guilt as a pervasive emotion? Do you feel guilt all the time? And that was precisely how I was feeling. I would try and rationalize my guilt by projecting it outwards. So I'd say, I feel this way because maybe I wasn't really particularly nice to my girlfriend when she was having a tough time, maybe, or I didn't give that homeless person change when they were asking for it, or I don't know. You try and rationalize it by saying things that you didn't do, and you think that will take away the feeling, but it doesn't. The feeling of guilt remains. There's no way that you can talk yourself out of it by trying to explain it on an individual level, and you realize that actually that what feels like a very specific emotion, like not, depression being understood as just a pervasive cloud. The fact that a very specific emotion like guilt constitutes it for a lot of people kind of tangles that argument that something that we think as being the result of individual action does not explain it away. When you account for everything that you've individually done, the feeling remains. And it's when you understand that, I think that's what Spinoza means in a way, where we place it within our abilities. Like, the mind isn't just passive to the fact that guilt is something that you are feeling. When you understand that it's something that the mind is doing, that it's producing, that it's not a result of individual action, that fundamentally changes how you understand what emotion is, I think. It becomes less of a pervasive just sadness, and actually becomes far more pointed. And trying to explain that away structurally is quite a kind of psychedelic process, I think. And that's the point, I think, in a way, of how Deleuze and Guattari are approaching schizophrenia and specifically Oedipus. So they talk about how schizophrenia is this universe. This is a quote. They say that schizophrenia is the universe of productive and reproductive desiring machines. It's the whole entanglement. It's the, to try and explain away guilt by making those ABC connections to things that you could have possibly done doesn't actually. It's a poor understanding of what depression is. A schizophrenic view of depression, schizophrenia not as a clinical diagnosis but as a critical apparatus, shows how you can make the leap from individual guilt to capitalist oppression with one or two strides. You don't need to do the hop, skip, and jump through all these different versions of these rationalizations. And doing that making those connections and doing away with that kind of framework is actually a more rationalist program, a more materialist program than what capitalism kind of imposes upon us. And I think that's kind of that's in a way, I think, is where these desiring machines, that shows how they plug into one another. That it's not like a kind of, it is like a human centipede. That's the image that kind of comes to my head. And if you want, you can focus on the individual experiences of everybody that's in that centipede, right? You can I think I saw a great parody article that was talking about like the person at the front of a human centipede doesn't understand their own privilege, that because they're eating, they're not swallowing any shit, but they still see themselves as being a part of the chain, so they don't get the privilege that they have, blah blah blah. But I guess what the point, I mean, that in a way is almost like identity politics. That's where the kind of it starts to crumble under its own guise. We can focus on the head end and the arse end of a human centipede, but I think what actually the reality of a capitalist system is that we're all kind of attached. It's an Ouroboros of shitting and eating. And that's kind of how Deleuze and Guattari open this whole book, right? They kind of say that right on the very first page, desiring production being the title, and they say it is at work everywhere, functioning smoothly at times, at other times in fits and starts. It breathes, it heats, it eats, it shits and fucks. What a mistake to have ever said the id. Everywhere it is machines, real ones, not figurative ones. Machines driving other machines, machines being driven by other machines, with all the necessary couplings and connections. And there's something to be said for, it's that kind of the materialist analysis in a way. It's like, I think we associate that with focusing in on particular circumstances. But the material reality is that we're all just part of the same human centipede, shitting and fucking and heating and eating. And whilst that seems like this extravagant, crazy, excessive image, it's actually far, when we realize that that's far closer to the reality than the structures that we put in place, that's pretty trippy and pretty heretical, I think. But that's precisely, I think, what they're doing. I did maybe have, again, I will shut up because I know I feel myself dragging on. But there was one extra thing I wanted to draw on, which is kind of going backwards, maybe slightly, to the issue of Freud and the Oedipus complex in that regard. And I think the best person for actually unpicking how Deleuze and Guattari are kind of building, making that movement from the specific and the kind of the understanding of ration, the false conflation of rationality to compartmentalization, as it were, and actually having the rational interrogation of the world around you being more schizophrenic is actually D.H. Lawrence. And I think that I've struggled to kind of make my own recent D.H. Lawrence obsession viral and spread it to anyone else that I know, because he's not very popular, but he is brilliant on this stuff, and he frequently turns up in A Thousand Plateaus and in a lot of Deleuze's writings, really. But anyway, he wrote these along with his various sexy books about groundskeepers shagging the mistress of the manor. He wrote these two separate texts quite apart, one called Fantasia of the Unconscious, and the other one called Psychoanalysis in the Unconscious. Fantasia of the Unconscious is the later one, right? It's far more lucid. And it's actually D.H. Lawrence in this sort of critical way who actually paves that he's sort of the precedent for Deleuze and Guattari, which I just think is, given Lawrence's reputation more generally, just I found that really kind of baffling, but it's true when you read it. Anyway, he has this chapter in Fantasia of the Unconscious called Trees and Babies and Mamas and Papas, where he's basically lampooning Freudian psychoanalysis, a few decades before it was popular. And he has this amazing scene, which I just want to read out and then I will shut up. But he begins, "Oh, damn the miserable baby, with its complicated ping-pong table of an unconscious. I'm sure, dear reader, you'd rather have to listen to the brat howling in its crib than to me expounding its plexuses. As for mixing those babies up, I'd mix him up like a shot if I'd anything to mix him with. Unfortunately, he's my own anatomical specimen of a pick-lead rabbit, so there's nothing to be done with the bits. But he gets on my nerves. I come out solemnly with a pencil and an exercise book and take my seat in all gravity at the foot of a large fir tree and wait for thoughts to come, gnawing like a squirrel on a nut, but the nut's hollow." And immediately it's hilarious because he's trying to basically pick a hole in Freudian psychoanalysis, the obsession with the origin, with the child, and he kind of, I think what Lawrence is basically trying to be Freud himself. He's trying to sit down with a pencil and paper in front of a crying baby and understand it, to sort of scientifically sit there, detached, objective, observe a bawling child and try and get some sort of rational insight from it, and discovers quite quickly it's very hard to concentrate when a baby's crying at you. And his mind wanders. He's not a schizophrenic, but he demonstrates this same impulse, which is kind of within all of us. He sat before a baby trying to think about how to think about crying, understanding how this rebellious, loud noise machine can be some sort of origin for the human species. And his mind drifts and he says, "I think there are too many trees. They seem to crowd around and stare at me, and I feel as if they nudge one another when I'm not looking. I can feel them standing there. And they don't let me get on with about the baby this morning, just their cussedness. I feel they encouraged me like a haram of wonderful silent wives yesterday." And he just goes on about trees forever. He's like, "Huge straight fir trees and big birch trees send rivers of roots under the ground, and cuckoos like noise falling on drops of the leaves, and me, a fool, sitting by the grassy wood road with a pencil and a book, hoping to write more about that baby." And what he ends up doing in a way is, whilst he's talking about it, he ends up actually, it's like the most extravagant metaphor that goes on for pages, that's basically saying how he can't see the wood for the trees. But he takes that truism, or that kind of like all too common adage, not truism, but I guess that's a better way of putting it. He takes it all too literally, as kind of a schizophrenic would. And he goes on and he's like, "Trees that have no hands and faces, no eyes, yet the powerful sap-scented blood roaring up the great columns, a vast individual life and an overshadowing will, the will of a tree, something that frightens you." I'm kind of talking again about a drive there. And he's now psychoanalyzing trees. So suppose you want to look a tree in the face. You can't. It hasn't got a face. You look at the strong body of a trunk. You look above you to the matter body hair of twigs and boughs. You see the soft green lips. But there is no eyes to look into. You can't meet its gaze. You keep looking at it in part and parcel. It's no good looking at a tree to know it. The only thing is a tree among the roots and nestle against this. The only thing is to sit among the roots and nestle against its strong trunk and not bother. That's how I write all of these planes and plexuses between the toes of a tree, forgetting myself against the great ankle of a trunk. And then, as a rule, a squirrel is stroked by its wickedness by the faceless magic of a tree, so I am usually stoked into forgetfulness and into scribbling this book, my tree book, really. And I think it's that kind of, that mind wanderingness, the kind of the unproductivity of procrastination becomes that schizophrenic out for a walk. He goes out. He's got the, you know, that's not a schizophrenic and a neurotic. That's D.H. Lawrence sat next to a tree, compared to having a baby on a couch. And I think it's that kind of imagery, that literariness of saying how, you know, you can't take in the whole forest, really. You can try to, but you kind of miss the interrelations. The way that you actually have to do both. To understand the forest, you have to understand the individual life of a tree, and then you have to understand in collectivity. And yes, you can break it all down, but nature, in that Spinozist sense, doesn't need to be compartmentalized. Natures. And it's kind of getting that perspective that radically explodes Freudian psychoanalysis and turns it into this Deleuze-Guattarian attempt to, you know, kind of live the non-fascist life, to exceed having to, you know, to record and pin everything down to butterfly boards or whatever else. That, you know, you can try to do that, but in a way, that's kind of there's not to say there's anything wrong with it. It's not kind of an anti-intellectual pursuit, but we have to be aware of the restrictions and the repressions that can result from that kind of the production of that kind of structure. We can categorize everything in the world around us, but we can't remove ourselves. Otherwise, that's when we kind of fall into that trap of removing ourselves from the process and creating these narratives that, you know, which is what fascism does. Becomes, even in with the best of intentions, loses sight of itself within the world and what, you know, it actually, you know, what it means to be human. And that starts, I guess, the part of, I'm rambling again, but the point being that starts straight away. That's kind of the point of psychoanalysis in a way, that process starts before we're even conscious of it. If we want to go back and unpack the origins, we have to go back to, you know, ourselves as children, to times we don't remember. And the fact that we spend so much time trying to unpack that process, that kind of unconscious, you know, or subconscious, or even just, you know, it's just not memorable. We don't have memories of ourselves as becoming who we are. The only thing you can do is kind of address what's happening in the midst of things. To keep looking back to the origin is where you start literally pinning yourself down, and it's a dangerous process. I think. I'm just going to shut up. I'm rambling. I probably keep rambling, but yeah.
Hello, listeners.
Sorry, that was like the match show for a minute there. I got totally carried away.
We'll see how much of that survives the edit. But a couple of
fair enough, really.
God, okay. So so there's a couple of points I want to bring from that. I think I do want to bring us slowly towards a conclusion, but again, I just want to refer to the text a couple more times here, because I think a great deal of what's going on here is, and because I think we said quite early on that a lot of this sounds very rarefied, but we should bear in mind, as is the case with a lot of French philosophy from this period, it's addressing what were living public intellectual conversations that were going on at the time. So, you know, when it's talking about psychoanalysis and so on, it's talking about like what was a very, very powerful institution in French intellectual society and so on. And so I think a lot of what's happening here when they are, you know, taking aim at Oedipus in the name of the productive unconscious is they just want to try and they're trying to dismantle this imperialism, because they want us to remember that, or not to remember, because again that's a going backwards, but they want this discovery of the actual potentials that do lie within the unconscious and lie within desire itself. And there's a couple of things they point out here. One's a passage from oh god, where is it? Oh, here it is. It's a very short passage here, which I think makes this point. When the break between Freud and Jung is discussed, the modest and practical point of disagreement that marked the beginning of their differences is too often forgotten. Jung remarks that in the process of transference, the psychoanalyst frequently appeared in the guise of a devil, or a god or a sorcerer, and that the roles he assumed in the patient's eyes went far beyond any sort of parental images. They eventually came to a total parting of the ways, yet Jung's initial reservation was a telling one. And there's another passage here which I will read because it's just genuinely quite funny, where they talk about Melanie Klein, and they talk because again, like, it's interesting to use the word imperialism here because there's this insistence in the psychoanalytic establishment, regardless whether it's Lacanian or Freudian, of this insistence of the perennialism of Oedipus, where they say here, it is no longer a question or a question of suggestion, but of sheer terrorism. Melanie Klein herself writes, and this is quoting from a case study of her analysing a child called Dick. The first time Dick came to me, he manifested no sort of affect when his nurse handed him over to me. When I showed him the toys I had put ready, he looked at them without the faintest interest. I took a big train and put it beside a smaller one and called them Daddy Train and Dick Train. That is also just quite funny. I will just say that is quite funny. Thereupon, he picks up a train I called Dick and made it roll to the window and said, "Station." I explained, "The station is Mummy. Dick is going into Mummy." He left the train, ran into the space between the outer and inner doors of the room, shutting himself in, saying "dark," and ran out again directly. He went through this performance several times. I explained to him, "It is dark inside Mummy. Dick is inside Dark Mummy." Again, there's quite a funny sentence. Meantime, he picked up the train again, but soon ran back into the space between the doors. While I was saying that he was going into Dark Mummy, he said twice in a questioning way, "Nurse?" As his analysis progressed, Dick had also discovered the wash basin as symbolising the mother's body, and he displayed an extraordinary dread of being wetted with water. End quote, back to D&G. Say that as Oedipus, or you'll get a slap in the face. The psychoanalyst no longer says to the patient, "Tell me a bit about your desiring machines, won't you?" Instead, he screams, "Answer Daddy and Mummy when I speak to you." and again, just on the stylistic point, this is what we've often said, but the Deleuze and Guattari are just really fun to read, and they're very. You used this word quite early on in our conversations about Deleuze and Guattari. They're very generative. They just do inspire a lot of thought and a lot of ideas when you read them because they're just so evocative. But I think in some ways the point they're making is a surprisingly simple one, but it's understood in the context of the public conversations that were going on in France at the time, which is pointing out like the reservation we all feel when we first hear about psychoanalysis and Freud and Oedipus, which is that, but surely it can't all be that. And indeed, they're just kind of shrugging and saying, no, it can't, can it? And if we are honest with ourselves, and again, a broader look at the history of psychoanalysis and its divergences kind of reveals that this is not a discovery unique to Deleuze and Guattari, but they made it a very, very forceful case for it, that an honest appreciation of the actual realities of desire demonstrates that no, it isn't all just that, which isn't to say that Oedipus isn't real, and they don't deny that this particular triangulation of desire occurs, but what they instead are simply saying, this is the difference between the kind of like anarchist communism that Deleuze and Guattari represents as opposed to any kind of fascism, is that they're saying that, but nothing is reducible back to a single root, because what is always initially there is the multiplicity, a multiplicity which is not reducible to a primordial one, and they make it very clear. And I'm going to say that we shouldn't go back to a discussion of the body without organs, because of the length of this conversation so far, but they're very clear that the body without organs is not the primordial one, which is like fractured by the desiring machines, but rather like where we end up in our initial arrival or discovery of ourselves is we're already in the midst of we're already a body without organs being tortured by desiring machines, and there's already the tension between the body without organs and the desiring machines, but these always exist as a multiple. There isn't a primordial one that they can be reduced to, and I think this, I will actually suggest this might be our closing point here, because one thing we've not talked about is social production, we've not talked about it very much or directly, but it has of course been in the background of a lot of what we're saying. Because one of the things we've already stated is that for Deleuze and Guattari, there is a continuum of desiring production, and there aren't separations between nature and human and individual and social. That it's all the same continuum of the production of production. And one of the machines that exists in the midst of social production is the miraculating machine, as they call it. And because they talk about production, inscription, and consumption, which they assert are actually all production. There isn't like the thing is produced, it is then recorded or inscribed, and then it is consumed as things distinct from each other. There is the process of production, and inscription is a form of production, and consumption is a form of production. But what happens at the level of the miraculating machine, as they call it, and I'm aware that we probably haven't spent as much time like defining these terms as perhaps we should have done, but the miraculating machine occurs in the context of the social body, which is not to be confused with the body without organs. The body without organs is a limit of production and not a limit of social production, which the schizophrenic embodies, and it is not the body that I'm talking about here. Sorry, I think this might be a bit confusing, but it's quite a difficult concept. But what the miraculating machine does is that the miraculating machine makes us think that it is the source of production, and the examples they give of miraculating machines or inscribing machines are the earth itself, the body of the despot, money, and because and I think really what's being discussed here is perhaps the Marxist concept of ideology, really, and because what capitalist ideology does to us is we forget that where the recorder that I am recording these words into came from it was put together by machines and people in a place, and then it was brought here. It wasn't made by money, it wasn't made by capital, it was produced by industrial activity. Capital isn't the source of these things. Capital or money or the despot miraculates these things, but the miraculation isn't the initial actual material putting together of the thing. It is the claiming of it and the imbuing of it with ideological meaning. So we end up believing that it is capital that produces these things, or it is the despot that ultimately is the source of these things, or a primitive concept of the earth that is the source of these things. And what we lose sight of is the continuum of production itself, and we become fixated on the inscribing and the miraculating, and we perceive these things as just kind of like arriving ready-made with their meanings already decided. But the truth of things is that if we push a little bit further, we rediscover the complicated continuum of the machinery, and what we also rediscover are the possibilities inherent in that, which we can get back to. Because what the body without organs in this sense represents for Deleuze and Guattari is, when I said it's and I think that goes back to our first episode where we talk about body without organs as a limit, is what we discover upon the surface of the body without organs is are the potentials for new directions for desiring machines can go, and new directions where the flows can go, and new intensities that we can discover as well. And they do state that the schizophrenic is the body without organs of capital, if I remember them correctly, because the schizophrenic represents that limit case where, for the schizophrenic, the flows of desire and the desiring machines they're no longer imbued with the tyranny of capital or the tyranny of Oedipus. The schizophrenic can just enjoy them as they are, and can discover new patterns of meaning to inscribe.
Yeah, I think that's like it's the one thing that I think from. I know you took the clinical angle, but I think again I always want to emphasize the critical angle. That I think that's the one. Well, yeah, I think that Deleuze and Guattari call it the family photo, right? But that's that Freud privileges one particular image or set of images to free his desire, and he freezes it into like familial representations. But I think Deleuze gets it from, whilst there's obviously resonances with psychoanalysts. I think Deleuze draws it mainly from William Burroughs, who kind of thrusts at that principle repeatedly, that any image, not just a familial representation, but any images can function can any image can capture desire, and the way that Freud focuses on the family is just is blinkered. But capital understands that, and the schizophrenic understands that, and I think it's that partly. Again, it reminds me again of what Mark Fisher was working on most towards the end of his life. That capitalism does not have the monopoly on desire, just as Oedipus doesn't. We can enclose desire into a socioeconomic image, but there's still a multitude out there of other things that we can understand desire by, and doing that is kind of a good first step to freeing ourselves from this multitude, with this never-ending and never-beginning multitude of, desiring production. Production itself is not monopolized by capitalism, and understanding things beyond those bounds is the first step to getting outside of them.
Yes. I don't have anything to add to that. I think we should probably bring the discussion to a close, because we're not too far from the 2-hour mark, and I like that we did just like completely chuck out our plan, and we have just kind of like and we followed the flows.
Yes.
Let's go through the things. Matt, where can people find you?
People can find me at xenogothic.com, xenogothic at xenogothic on Twitter, and Matt at xenogothic.com for email. That's probably the main three. Where can people find you, Sean?
You can follow me on Twitter at Hauntonaut, and not really anywhere else, to be perfectly honest with you, because I don't do things. I have a real job. This is my fun bit at the what I do outside of that. I think that's it really then, isn't it? I've been Sean. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, and I've been Matt, and yeah, thanks for putting up with us. Thanks for putting up with our rambles and our flows, but hopefully, I hope this has been generative. I think that's our main wish, right? We could be as generative as the other pair are. That's can't ask for any more than that. And so, yeah, looking forward to next time to see what else we can generate.
Precisely. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.